April 12, 1945. The morning air carried an unfamiliar stillness, the kind that settles only after storms, only when something enormous has shifted far beyond the horizon. Fog clung low to the ground at Camp Aliceville, curling around the posts of the fence and drifting lazily through the open space where men had once stood in rigid formation. Even the crows were silent. Hauptmann Erich Müller woke before the bugle. It took several seconds for him to realize why the air felt different. There was no tension in it, no quiet dread, only anticipation, heavy, electric, unspoken. The murmur began in the far barracks, then swept along the rows like an unseen wind. The war is over. Hitler is dead. Germany has surrendered. The words were passed from mouth to mouth in fragments, half believed, half feared. Müller sat upright on his bunk, staring at the pale light threading through the slats of the window. He'd imagined the end of the war 1,000 times, in fire, in defeat, in a bullet to the skull, in shame. Not like this, not with birds chirping and boots crunching calmly outside. A whistle blew, then another. Not sharp, gentle, a summons without urgency. Men streamed into the central square, Germans in faded grey, Americans in olive drab, all glancing at one another as if the answers might be written on each other's faces. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward. He hadn't slept. The veins in his eyes were red, but his expression was almost serene. "It's official," he announced. His voice carried without shouting. "Germany has surrendered. Hostilities in Europe have ceased." No cheers erupted, no cries of victory, only silence. And then, from somewhere in the line of prisoners, a soft, broken sob. Otto Braun covered his face with both hands. Becker sat down slowly on the ground, as if his legs had forgotten their purpose. Gerhard Weiss stared blankly at the watchtower he had come to ignore. The war that had defined their youth, their crimes and loyalties and fears, had ended without their participation. Sergeant Carter removed his helmet. When he spoke, his voice was not the voice of a victor, but of a man speaking to other men. "Orders from Washington say you'll remain here until repatriation is arranged. But understand this," he paused. "You are no longer our wartime enemy. You are men who must now return and build whatever comes next." He scanned the faces before him. "How you remember what you learned here, that part is up to you." Later that afternoon, the gate at the far end of the compound, the one that had remained closed and symbolic for so long, creaked open for the first time. Trucks rolled in bearing white tarps and crates marked for processing and transport. But no one rushed toward freedom. They stood hesitant, as if crossing that line meant abandoning the strange, fragile peace they had found. Instead, something else happened. Müller stepped forward first, slow, measured, until he stood directly before the open gate. He turned around, looked at the men behind him, then at the guards he had once sworn to defeat. "You let us watch your films," he said, his English rough but clear. "You let us remember who we were. We will not forget that." Private Tommy Lewis swallowed hard. He could feel the world pivoting on this moment in the most ordinary of places. Müller extended his hand. The wire, the guns, the ranks. None of it moved. Then Sergeant Carter stepped forward and took it. A firm shake, nothing more, nothing less. And in that instant, the war inside both men ended with more certainty than any document signed in a distant city. As the sun lowered past the watchtowers, the projector was set up one last time. No orders demanded it. No policy required it. They gathered together, guards and former prisoners, around the old, faithful sheet. The final film flickered to life. A simple black and white story about men walking away from ruins, carrying seeds, cutting through soil, planting beginnings. No one spoke. They did not need to. Camp Aliceville, with all its wire and walls, had become something history would never fully capture. Not a place of captivity, but a place where enemies learned, painfully and beautifully, how thin the line truly was between hatred and humanity. And when the final frame burned out, leaving only darkness and the quiet breathing of men who had survived, there was no need for applause, only memory. On the screen behind them, blank and colorless, the faint shadows of the musicians danced as the floodlights caught their movements. The ghosts of another culture, another life, played out in trembling silhouette for Americans and Germans alike. Müller felt something give way inside his chest. A memory of a cafe in Berlin. A woman's laugh, snow falling on quiet rooftops. His mother opening a window and humming as she cooked. Things he had buried beneath obedience and steel orders now returned, bright, painful, beautiful. He noticed that no guard moved closer, no rifle shifted. The camp might as well have vanished beyond the veil of music. There were no captors, no prisoners, only men listening. When the peace ended, the stillness that followed was sacred. Then applause rose, louder than at any movie, rawer, more desperate. The Americans clapped. The Germans bowed awkwardly. Becker's hands trembled on his cello bow, his eyes filled with disbelief. Baum looked toward Sergeant Carter, expecting perhaps a command to step down. Instead, Carter stood and saluted them, not as prisoners but as fellow men. The mood of the camp altered after that night. The Germans began teaching English words voluntarily. The Americans tried their hands at German phrases, laughing at mangled pronunciations. A chalkboard was placed near the mess hall for language lessons. Children's drawings appeared there, simple pictures of houses, trees, shoes, bread, the sun. Gerhard Weiss sketched a movie theater with a large sign above it in childish English, "Friends." Lieutenant Hayes saw it the next morning and did not erase it. "Do you think they will hang us when we go home?" Gerhard asked Müller one night. The question hung like frost in the air. "For what?" Müller said quietly. "For laughing with the enemy." Müller looked out through the wire into the dark Alabama countryside, distant lights blinking like tiny universes of peace. "If they do," he said after a long pause, "then I would rather be punished for remembering what it means to live than praised for forgetting." Winter crept in gently. Men wore extra coats. Blankets were distributed by the Red Cross. The film nights continued. The orchestra grew. An American chaplain and a German pastor shared the same stage one Sunday, alternating prayers in two languages once thought irreconcilable. The world beyond still burned. Cities shattered, armies bled, flags fell. Yet inside this small fenced rectangle of earth, something unplanned, undocumented, and almost impossible had taken root. Not alliance, not forgiveness, but recognition. And recognition, more than artillery or bombers, had the power to end wars long before peace treaties were ever signed. In the quiet of his bunk that night, Müller stared at the wooden slats above him. He realized that the shock had never truly been about movies or popcorn or music at all. It was about discovering that the enemy had a heart, and that, against all expectation, it beat much like his own. September 17th, 1944. A faint autumn wind slid through the compound, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth from the forest beyond Camp Aliceville. The air had changed. The heat had softened into a gentle, forgiving warmth. Somewhere a crow cawed unseen. The calendar inside the guardhouse had lost most of its pages, torn away day by day by a private who wanted to feel time slipping forward. The war moved closer to its end, though no one yet spoke those words aloud. On this evening, men gathered for something that had not come from American orders alone. It came from the prisoners. A small wooden platform had been constructed near the screen, built from scrap lumber hammered together under the supervision of Sergeant Carter, who pretended not to notice how carefully the Germans measured and leveled each plank. On it stood a makeshift orchestra. 3 violins scavenged through the Red Cross, a battered trumpet, a hand-carved flute, and a cello crafted from spare wood by a former carpenter named Heinrich Baum. Müller stood near the front watching. The sight of Germans preparing music rather than battle formations unsettled him more than enemy artillery ever had. He spotted Becker near the cello, carefully tightening a string. "You never told me you played," Müller said quietly. "I did not know it mattered," Becker replied simply. American guards formed a loose ring beyond the stage, curious but relaxed. Some leaned against the fence, others sat on crates. Private Tommy Lewis wriggled into a place near the front, resting his chin on crossed arms. He had never heard German music beyond military marches, blaring from propaganda newsreels. This moment felt intimate, almost forbidden. Baum raised his carved baton. Silence settled across the compound. Then the first note blossomed. It was soft, trembling at the edges, a test of breath and confidence. The second violin joined, then the cello, and soon the sound thickened into a haunting melody. It was Schubert, a piece meant for warm living rooms and candlelight, not war camps and barbed wire. The music rose like a memory reclaimed. Men closed their eyes, shoulders relaxed. Some tilted their heads back, as if the sound itself was washing years from them. Sergeant Carter slowly lowered himself onto a crate, suddenly aware of the sweat behind his eyes. He did not wipe it away. Private Tommy Lewis stood at third base, hands on his knees, watching the spectators. He noticed that the lines between them and us had softened into something almost imperceptible. They were still separated by uniform, by language, by ideology, but the game had dragged them into the same childish pursuit. Hit, run, catch, cheer. "You ever think this is wrong?" he asked Sergeant Carter quietly.
"Wrong how? They tried to kill us, sir."
"And now we're letting them play games." Carter didn't answer immediately. He observed the field, the dust, the awkward joy. "Maybe this is exactly what wins a war," he finally said. "Not bullets, just the proof that there's another way to live." In the days that followed, more ordinary miracles crept into the routine. The Germans were assigned small jobs within the camp: kitchen duty, laundry, repairing fences under watch. Some worked in nearby fields, returning each evening with baskets of produce. They received wages, a few cents per day, and could use them at a small camp canteen. They purchased paper, pencils, chocolate bars, even cheap harmonicas. Men who once wrote only military reports now wrote letters home in trembling cursive. Klaus Fischer sat on his bunk one night, pencil hovering above the paper. "My dearest Anna," he began, "you will not believe me, but tonight I watched an American film. I drank sweet coffee. I laughed. I do not understand this war anymore." He paused, staring at the line as if it accused him of betrayal. Still, he did not cross it out. Movies became a ritual westerns. Comedies, not romance. Even animated cartoons. Tiny characters bouncing across the screen in defiance of gravity and reality alike. For 90 minutes at a time, the war evaporated. The fences faded beyond the edges of vision. Men leaned back against one another, whispering translations under their breath, pointing at the screen and grinning like schoolboys. But with kindness came confusion, and with confusion came a quiet unease. "Why are they so gentle?" Becker asked one night as the credits rolled. Miller watched an American guard roll up the screen, hands unconcerned around the pole. "Perhaps," he said after a long silence, "because they expect to win. And when you are certain of victory, you can afford kindness." This thought clung to him, because kindness from a conquered enemy would have been unimaginable. Mercy had never been part of the philosophy that raised him. Strength was domination, order was force. And yet the Americans controlled them completely, and chose, again and again, not to crush them beneath that control. That realization was more unsettling than any punishment. One night, a preacher from the nearby town came to offer a service. He spoke of forgiveness, of enemies dining at the same table in some distant spiritual future. The words flowed through the room like gentle rain, settling into places untouched by doctrine or patriotism. And among the prisoners, men who had marched under banners of hate, men who had believed unquestioningly, a different battle had begun. Not between nations, but inside themselves.
The applause faded, dissolving back into the night. For a moment, no one rose. The screen, now blank and slack, swayed slightly in the warm wind, as if reluctant to let go of the world it had just shown. Sergeant Carter was the first American to move. He stepped forward, stretched his back, and called out, "All right, men, stand down in an orderly manner." The German word Ordnung echoed in some of the prisoners' minds. Bitter and familiar, yet his tone carried no menace. It was almost neighborly. The prisoners stood. There was no rush for the exits, no desperate scramble for the barracks, as if freedom suddenly waited there. They filed out in neat columns, boots thudding softly against packed dirt. Muller walked in silence, the images of the evening flickering again behind his eyes. Dancing women, factory lines, a kiss. The wire waited for him at the edge of the compound, unmoving, patient. "Same time tomorrow night," Corporal Ellis called out, without thinking, surprised by his own casual offer. A cluster of Germans paused. Becker glanced back over his shoulder, unsure if the words were directed at them. When he saw them nod, some with a faint hesitant smile, a ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Tomorrow night. The phrase struck Miller like a small, impossible miracle. Tomorrow night he would still be a prisoner. Tomorrow night, the war would still rage somewhere beyond the horizon. But tomorrow night also meant, undeniably, another motion picture, another strip of existence where nothing burned. The following evening, the atmosphere had changed. Where before men had stood stiff and uncertain, now they arrived with expectancy. Word had rippled through the barracks. There will be another film tonight. Men washed their faces more carefully at the basins. Some even attempted to straighten their uniforms, pressing creases with flat palms. The Americans noticed, exchanging glances they didn't comment on out loud. Before the film, the guards organized a game, baseball. Most of the Germans had never held a bat. The repeated explanation of rules, gestures, broken English, and improvised German produced more confusion than clarity. And yet when the first ball was pitched and cracked sharply against the bat, sailing into the dusky air, the compound came alive. Men chased it, tripped, laughed. Serious soldiers lunged clumsily for bases outlined in white powder. Sergeant Carter demonstrated how to slide into second, raising a cloud of dust and whooping when he landed. Otto Brown tried the same and ended up flat on his back, roaring with laughter so contagious that even the most rigid among them couldn't help but join. For the first time since his capture, Muller laughed without restraint. The sound surprised him. He had forgotten what it felt like to laugh without calculating the consequences.
Miller's jaw tightened. He had known in the intellectual part of his brain that Germany was losing ground. But knowledge was abstract. This was visceral. Each frame of machinery pressed against his chest like the recoil of a cannon. And yet the narration was calm. Proud, there was no gloating. Just numbers, machines, motion. Braun exhaled slowly. "They show this to us on purpose," he muttered. "Yes," Becker answered, "and they do not need to say a word." From the tower, Tommy Lewis watched the mood change. Laughter softened into distant, quiet concentration. Popcorn went half-eaten, forgotten on tongues. The war had crept back into the square, camouflaged in celluloid truth. Still no one stood, no one shouted. No one moved for the wire. When the reel finally flapped loose and the screen flared white, the projector winding down, a hush remained. Fireflies blinked at the edges of the compound. A dog barked in the town a mile away, living his private peace. Then, like a fragile bridge stretching between two enemies, applause emerged. Scattered at first, then swelling. American hands and German hands clapped alike, a brief overlapping rhythm that hung in the air. Lieutenant Hayes looked around at the men, guards, prisoners, silhouettes and faces softened by darkness, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It was not triumph, it was not mercy. It was something quieter, harder to name, understanding maybe, or the beginning of a question that the war had never prepared them to answer. The film rolled on, its grainy images dancing over the faces of men who had not expected to feel anything other than suspicion. A comedian slipped on a peel, arms windmilling in exaggerated humiliation. The timing was precise, universal. Against his will, Lieutenant Hans Becker let out a sharp laugh, a sound that startled him more than incoming artillery ever had. He clamped his jaw, eyes darting to see if any officer had noticed. But no one reprimanded him. In fact, from further down the line, a deep, surprised chuckle erupted from Feldwebel Dieter Kranz, followed by another, until the entire first row of prisoners rippled with restrained amusement. American guards shifted their weight, boots crunching lightly on the gravel, but their faces remained neutral. Sergeant Carter caught the glance of Lieutenant Hayes, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Let 'em laugh," Hayes murmured. "That's the whole point." For the Germans, laughter in uniform had become a rarity, an embarrassment at best, a liability at worst. On the Eastern Front, a moment of distraction meant death. In France, laughter had faded into a memory, replaced by the smell of damp earth and burned rubber. Now in rural Alabama, beneath a soft American sky filled with indifferent stars, laughter returned like a long-lost comrade. Otto Brown leaned toward Klaus Fischer. "This is their weapon," he whispered, nodding at the screen. "They drown you in normal life until you cannot remember why you hated them." Klaus's brow furrowed as if considering the remark as a tactical observation. Yet even as he processed it as strategy, his lips twitched when the actor mimed outrage at a lamp that refused to turn on. On screen, the scene shifted. The dance hall lights dimmed. Music began crackling through static. A slow foxtrot filled the speakers mounted on a wooden platform. A woman in a glittering dress twirled, smiling into the eyes of her partner. She was light, alive, an embodiment of a world without ration books or air raid sirens. For a moment, Miller forgot that beyond the compound lay the boundaries of war. He forgot the rigid maps, the last retreat, the taste of stale bread on a freezing morning. He saw only movement and light. Somewhere behind him, a voice murmured in awe, "So that is America." Not the industrial America of guns and tanks, not the distant America of generals and diagrams, but the America of flickering theaters, music, dance, and buttered popcorn. Private Tommy Lewis felt a strange unease settle in his chest. He had cousins fighting in the Ardennes. He had read letters from a brother-in-law stationed in Italy, turned hard, humorless. Yet here were German soldiers, men his country had named monsters, reacting to a love story on a borrowed sheet like any group of small-town boys. He imagined one of them standing in a village, hands in pockets, watching a film from the back row just as he once had. The thought unsettled him more than any threat. A young prisoner, no older than 19, leaned forward with unguarded fascination. His name was Gerhard Weiss, recently captured in Normandy. His cheeks were still full, untouched by hunger. He watched the screen as if studying a secret language. When the dancing couple kissed, his face flushed and then he grinned openly, uncaring that he was wearing the uniform of a defeated nation. For 10 minutes he was simply a boy watching a film. Lieutenant Hayes cleared his throat softly and stepped closer to the edge of the seated rows. His voice was controlled but firm. "You men enjoy," he said, choosing each word carefully. "There's a second reel after this." That was all. No proclamation of generosity. No reminder of confinement. It was an invitation without expectations. The movie shifted again, now a newsreel. American factories turning out endless rows of aircraft, women riveting wings, men welding steel. The Germans stiffened instinctively. They recognized this imagery. They had heard reports, exaggerated accounts of impossible output. Now it streamed before them, unfiltered and undeniable. Conveyor belts, rows of tanks, propellers spinning in perfect sequence. The casual might of a nation that had turned production into prophecy. Lieutenant Hayes moved through the rows, cataloging names on a clipboard, checking that men sat where the camp roster required. His expression was unreadable. He had received orders from the War Department to maintain humane treatment, to follow the Geneva Conventions as if the camps were not only a shield for the prisoners, but also a statement of American values. He was a small man in a big uniform, carrying the weight of policy in his pocket. He had seen men transformed by kindness and by cruelty alike. He had learned that gestures, even small ones like a bowl of popcorn, did more than feed. As the film unspooled, scenes of a city in sunlight rolled across the screen. A couple dancing on a rooftop, a man whistling as he walks past a florist, a streetcar ringing its bell. The German soldiers watched the cadence of easy motion, the kind of motion that comes from a life not interrupted by shells and orders. A murmur ran along the rows. The jokes, the facial expressions, a collective inhalation at a sight that looked unnervingly like home. Müller's hands, which had steadied a rifle through towns he would rather forget, now clenched the edge of his seat. He felt not only nostalgia, but a thin, sharp ache. The world on the screen spoke a language he recognized, but the grammar had changed. From the guard tower, Private First Class Thomas "Tommy" Lewis watched too, his elbows resting on the rail. He was 19, home before the war had even been properly explained to him. and the soft light of the projector made the freckles on his nose look like constellations. He had been taught to view these men as enemies, disciplined, dangerous, to be watched closely. Yet as a young American laughed at a comic on the screen and a German on the front row smiled back, something complicated happened inside Tommy. He felt the tug of curiosity, of being human in the face of an enemy who was suddenly less enemy than neighbor in the dark. No announcement had been made, no propaganda speech. Just film, butter, and the small defiant act of sharing leisure beneath barbed wire. The night stretched, and with each reel the boundaries thinned. Dill-scented sweat dried on uniforms. The projector whirred on, relentless and indifferent, turning celluloid into memory. And somewhere in that hum, a question that had no single answer began to pulse. What do you do when the enemy gives you a reason to laugh? June 28, 1944, Aliceville, Alabama. A raw, humid night that smelled of cut grass and diesel from the supply trucks rolling into the compound. The moon hung low and pale over the barbed wire teeth of Camp Aliceville, throwing long, trembling shadows across the blanketed lines of wooden barracks. Lanterns hummed, a distant generator thumped like a tired heart. The air tasted faintly of oil and something sweeter, butter and sugar being heated in a battered pot near the mess hall. A projector would mean popcorn, and popcorn tonight meant a crowd. Hauptmann Erich Müller stood at the wire with his hands folded over the cold steel, peering into the glow. He wore a faded field-gray tunic, the silver braid of his rank dulled by months of sun and work, his cap tucked under his arm. Beside him, Lieutenant Hans Becker traced the letters stamped on his dog tags with a thumb that trembled only a little. The two had stood on battlefields that smelled of cordite and wet furrows, had crawled through hedgerows and watched men die under a copper sky. Now they stood before a line of men whose faces were lit with something almost unfamiliar, anticipation. Across the dirt square, Sergeant James Carter tightened his bootlaces and checked the clip of his M1 Garand with the practiced, economical motions of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He wore the olive drab of the 94th Military Police Company. His sleeves bore the tiny faded chevrons of a man who'd traded Europe's mud for America's heat. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the camp's adjutant, rubbed a thumb along the edge of a crate marked "Projector, Fragile," and barked a soft order to Corporal Ellis to set up the screen. The men moved, quick, efficient, automatic. Around the mess tent, a knot of prisoners gathered. Obergefreiter Klaus Fischer, who still kept a pressed photograph of his wife folded inside his boot. Gefreiter Otto Braun, who hummed a tune under his breath and whose hands were stained from peeling potatoes in the kitchen detail. Older men with eyes like old maps, faces weathered with winter and small countryside losses. They spoke in low voices, a careful German that kept secrets even from friends. The camp required them to surrender weapons. It did not ask them to surrender memories. Yet tonight, those memories pressed against them with the thinness of skin. They had known order and chaos. Now they were being offered something else, a seat in the dark, to watch images of a world they had been taught was enemy. The screen was strung between two poles, a pale rectangle in the night. The generator spat sparks as Corporal Ellis threaded the heavy film through the projector, reels hissing like distant rain. The projector's lamp bloomed, a hot white that smelled of ozone and warmed metal. The first frames flickered and then steadied into motion. Faces lit, shadows fell, and for a moment the camp was a different planet. The guard towers still pierced the sky, the searchlights still swept like eyes, but the square hummed with a different electricity. Laughter, unsure and tentative, bubbled up from the ranks of men in uniform. Müller felt the laugh catch in his throat. He had read newspapers at the front, grainy things handed from hand to hand, and had memorized words that seethed with bitterness about the enemy's decadence. He had seen GI rations, tasted the canned beef, had been fed by Red Cross parcels in a way that embarrassed him and yet kept him alive. Still, the sight of American soldiers, young, freckled, slack-jawed, handing him popcorn, felt like a small betrayal of everything the Reich had told him about the West. A corporal named Friedrich Janssen whispered, "Why would they do this?" The question had no edge of cynicism at first. It was honest bewilderment, as if asked by a child.